Have you ever wondered why God allows suffering? Have you ever felt helpless, crying out for answers that seem never to come? In today's video, we will delve into the story of the prophet Habakkuk, a man who, like many of us, faced moments of doubt and questioned God's silence. Through his journey, we will discover how to transform pain into unshakable faith and find hope even in the darkest times. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. By doing so, you help us reach more people who need this message of hope. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your experience may inspire others in their own journeys of faith. With that said, let's dive into today's story. Habakkuk lived in difficult times, marked by injustice, violence, and corruption. It was impossible to walk the streets without feeling the weight of the suffering that dominated his people. Evil seemed to grow, and those who were supposed to bring justice became more corrupt with each passing day. It wasn't just a political or social crisis, it was also a spiritual crisis. God seemed distant, silent. Habakkuk, a man of faith, felt his people's pain as if it were his own. And like many of us, he couldn't understand why heaven seemed closed. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? This question, filled with pain and frustration, came from the prophet's lips, but could easily be ours. How many times have we faced situations where everything seems out of control, an incurable illness, mounting financial problems, relationships falling apart? God's silence in these moments hurts. It feels like he isn't listening. It feels like he doesn't care. Habakkuk looked around and saw chaos. He didn't just observe it, he carried the anguish of his people in his heart. It was as if he were crying out not only for himself, but for everyone who suffered unjustly. Have you ever felt that weight? The feeling that the world is falling apart and that your prayers, no matter how sincere or desperate, are not being heard. What makes Habakkuk so special is that he didn't hide his pain or suppress his doubts. He brought them directly to God. And this is a powerful lesson for us. How many times do we swallow our suffering, believing we shouldn't question? Habakkuk shows us that it's possible to be honest with God. Even in his frustration, he believed God could hear. And that is faith in the midst of crisis. Habakkuk didn't ask for riches or power. He didn't ask to be spared from suffering. He cried out for justice. He wanted to understand. Why do you make me look at injustice and tolerate wrongdoing? The prophet's question reflects the pain of someone who not only suffers, but also feels powerless in the face of injustice. Isn't that how we feel when we see children starving, families destroyed by wars, or even when we face problems we can't solve? By the end of this first chapter, it becomes clear that Habakkuk is in a moment of confrontation. He doesn't accept things as they are. He wants answers. And this search is something we can all relate to. After all, who hasn't wished for God to explain his actions or apparent lack of them? Habakkuk teaches us that questioning is not a lack of faith. On the contrary, it is the act of someone who believes that God cares and has answers, even when he seems silent. Habakkuk expected quick and clear answers, but instead, he was met with silence, a silence that felt overwhelming, almost unbearable. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the feeling that his words had been lost in a void. He looked to the sky and saw no sign that God was listening. This only deepened his anguish. And here's something many of us have faced, that moment when we pray, cry out, and nothing seems to change. As the prophet tried to process the divine silence, he began to wonder if his prayers truly made a difference. It's a common doubt. Perhaps you've asked yourself, does God really hear me? Or am I just talking to the walls? For Habakkuk, the silence wasn't just frustrating, it was confusing. After all, he believed in a just God, a God who had always cared for his people. So why now did it seem like this same God was distant, allowing chaos to reign? Habakkuk observed the streets of his city. He saw injustice thriving, the wicked triumphing, and the innocent suffering. God's laws seemed to have lost their value, and evil was taking over everything. He thought, if God is so powerful, why doesn't he intervene? Yet at the same time, he knew that God was sovereign. This contradiction between what he believed about God and what he saw around him left him torn. Isn't it the same with us? When we face situations we can't understand, it's natural to try to make sense of the suffering. We search for answers, but often what we find is silence. God's silence makes us question what we believe. Is he listening? Does he care? Is he still in control? Yet Habakkuk didn't give up. He continued to question, to seek, to cry out. Because even in the silence, he knew God was there. That's what sets him apart, his persistence in seeking answers, even when it seemed like none would come. He understood that silence wasn't necessarily an absence. Perhaps it was a preparation. Perhaps it was an invitation to trust even more. At this point, Habakkuk's struggle became even more personal. The silence wasn't just a negative response, it was a test of his faith. Could he continue to trust God even when he didn't understand what was happening? Can we? Habakkuk was about to discover something that would change his perspective forever. God's silence would not last, and the response that was coming would transform not only the prophet, but also all of us who connect with his story. After so much pleading and silence, God finally answered Habakkuk. But God's response did not bring the comfort the prophet was expecting. On the contrary, it was a shocking and unsettling revelation. God revealed that he was indeed acting, but in a completely unexpected way. He would use the Chaldeans, a violent and cruel nation, as an instrument of judgment against the people of Judah. This answer was a true shock for Habakkuk. How could a just God use an even more wicked people to correct the sins of Israel? It was as if God were saying, I see the evil you see, Habakkuk. I am aware of the suffering and corruption, and I am already working on it, but in my way, not yours. Imagine the impact of this. Habakkuk went from being frustrated with the silence to being frustrated with the response. He wanted justice, but not like this. This raises a common question in our lives. What happens when God answers our prayers in a way we don't understand or don't want? How many times have we prayed for a solution, only to find the answer seems worse than the problem? God described the Chaldeans as an unstoppable force. They were swift, cruel, and voracious, destroying everything in their path. It was hard for Habakkuk to accept that this nation would be used by God. After all, he believed God was holy and pure, incapable of tolerating evil. This response seemed to contradict everything Habakkuk knew about God's character. And how often does this happen to us? When God acts in ways we cannot understand, our faith is challenged. We might feel like Habakkuk asking, Lord, is this really part of your plan? How can this be just? It's a reminder that God's ways are beyond our comprehension. However, Habakkuk did not remain silent. He expressed his confusion and indignation to God. He said, Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Once again he was questioning, but not in despair. He questioned because he knew God had answers. Here is an important lesson. It's okay not to understand. It's okay to question. Habakkuk shows us that we can bring our doubts and fears to God. He does not reject us for this. In fact, God desires for us to turn to him even when we are confused. God's response, though difficult to accept, carried an important message. He was in control. Even when it seemed like the wicked were winning, God had a plan. The Chaldeans were not an autonomous force. They were a tool in the hands of the Almighty. This chapter challenges us to trust God, even when his actions seem incomprehensible. Sometimes his answers don't make sense in the moment, but they are part of something much greater. Habakkuk was beginning to realize this, though he still had a long way to go. God was planting the seeds of a profound truth that would transform Habakkuk's perspective. And perhaps through this story, he is also planting something in our hearts, the faith to trust, even when the answer doesn't make sense. Habakkuk was at a boiling point. God's response had left him even more perplexed than the silence. Now he wasn't just facing unanswered questions, he had to grapple with the reality of an answer that challenged everything he believed about justice. How could a just and holy God use such a cruel people to correct his own? It didn't make sense. He began to dialogue with God again, bringing even more questions. Why do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? Habakkuk's struggle is one many of us can relate to. How often do we face situations that leave us confused, where it feels like God is allowing something that contradicts what we know about Him? Habakkuk knew God was holy, he knew God was good, but the reality he was facing seemed to paint a different picture. This is where many of us can identify. When our experiences don't seem to align with our faith, we are challenged to find balance, and that balance often comes with pain. However, instead of giving up, Habakkuk made an important decision. He would wait. He declared, "I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me, and what answer I am to give to this complaint." This is profound. He decided to stop, observe, and listen. He chose to trust that God still had something to say, even when he didn't understand what was happening. This act of waiting is crucial. In such a fast-paced world, we want quick answers and immediate solutions. But Habakkuk's waiting teaches us that true faith often requires patience. God doesn't move on our time, but on His. And this waiting is part of the process of shaping and transforming us. As he waited, Habakkuk reflected on God's greatness. He remembered that God had created the world, ruled over nations, and was sovereign over everything. These reflections didn't erase his doubts, but they began to put his questions into perspective. When we consider God's vastness, our limited understanding starts to expand. Habakkuk's inner struggle shows us something important. Faith isn't the absence of questions, but the willingness to bring those questions to the only one who can answer them. Often we want to understand everything before we trust, but God calls us to trust before we understand. It's an invitation to believe that even when we don't see the full picture, He is still in control. Habakkuk was on an intense spiritual journey. He didn't yet have all the answers, but he was beginning to see that his trust in God didn't have to depend on his ability to comprehend everything. This realization was the beginning of his transformation. And perhaps it's the beginning of ours too, as we face our own struggles with reality and faith. While Habakkuk waited in his watchtower, something extraordinary happened. God spoke again, but this time his message was not just an answer to Habakkuk's questions. It was a revelation meant to change his perspective forever. God said, "Write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so that a runner may read it." It was as if God was saying, "What I am about to show you is not just for you, Habakkuk. It is for all who need hope, now and in the future." This vision from God carried a central and transformative truth. The righteous shall live by faith. It was a simple yet powerful declaration. God wasn't promising to immediately remove the suffering or provide a visible solution. Instead, He was showing that the key to enduring hard times wasn't in understanding everything, but in trusting Him completely. Habakkuk began to understand that God's justice wasn't limited by time or circumstances. God was saying that even if evil seemed to triumph, even if the Chaldeans were victorious for a time, they wouldn't have the final word. God was in control of everything, and in due time, He would bring judgment and restoration. This message connects deeply to our lives. How often do we wait for God to give us complete explanations before trusting Him? We want to see the entire plan, understand every detail before taking the next step. But God calls us to live by faith, not by sight. Faith isn't based on what we see or feel, but on trusting who God is. God continued revealing His vision to Habakkuk, showing that the Chaldeans, though used as instruments of correction, would also be judged for their cruelty. He described 5 woes against them, condemning their greed, violence, and idolatry. This part of the vision reinforced that God was indeed just and that evil would never go unpunished. Habakkuk began to realize something even deeper. God wasn't just correcting Israel or judging the Chaldeans. He was teaching an eternal lesson about faith, justice, and trust. This vision transcended time and space, pointing to a God who works in silence but is never inactive. The phrase, "the righteous shall live by faith," became a landmark not only for Habakkuk, but for the entire biblical story. It would later be echoed by apostles like Paul, influencing generations and shaping Christian theology. Faith, as God revealed to Habakkuk, isn't passive. It is active, a daily decision to trust, even when everything feels uncertain. Habakkuk began to surrender to this truth. He realized that God's justice might not be immediate, but it was certain. He understood that God's silence didn't mean absence, and that His answers, even when hard to understand, were always for a greater good. This moment of revelation brought not just clarity, but also peace. Habakkuk didn't have all the answers, but he had something better, a vision of who God was and a renewed trust in His sovereignty. This is where many of us need to arrive in our own journeys. We may not have all the answers to life's suffering or difficulties, but we can choose to trust the One who controls all things. The righteous shall live by faith. This truth echoes in the hearts of those who, like Habakkuk, face doubts, pain, and difficult times. The vision God gave the prophet is a reminder that faith isn't just a tool to endure suffering, it's a powerful weapon to live above it. Habakkuk began to see beyond his circumstances. He understood that even if chaos continued, God was working on something greater. He didn't need to see the end to trust. He just needed to live by faith, one day at a time. Habakkuk, now transformed by God's vision and message, does something extraordinary. He responds with a prayer. But this is not a prayer of lament or doubt, as before. It is a prayer of praise, trust, and total surrender to God's sovereignty. It is a song that demonstrates renewed faith, a heart that has learned to trust the Lord, even as the world around him continues to crumble. At the beginning of his prayer, Habakkuk acknowledges God's majesty. He says, "Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds." This declaration shows that Habakkuk, despite everything, understands who God is, a powerful God, worthy of reverence, who works in times and ways beyond human understanding. He no longer tries to control the situation or question God's methods. Instead, he asks, "Renew your works, Lord, in our day. Make them known." This request reflects a profound change in the prophet's heart. Earlier, Habakkuk wanted answers. Now he wants God to fulfill his will. He recognizes that God is the Lord of history and that his works, even when incomprehensible, are always just and good. This teaches us something powerful. True faith is not just accepting God's plans, but desiring their fulfillment, even when it means going through difficult times. As he continues his prayer, Habakkuk recalls God's mighty acts in the past. He mentions events that demonstrate divine sovereignty, such as the Exodus and the deliverance of Israel. He describes God as a mighty warrior whose power makes the mountains tremble and the seas roar. This part of the prayer reminds us that even when we face seemingly insurmountable challenges, The same God who acted in the past is still at work today. But the most impactful moment in Habakkuk's prayer comes at the end when he declares, "Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior." This declaration is a testament to the transformation that has taken place in Habakkuk's heart. He is no longer seeking answers or signs. His faith is no longer dependent on circumstances. He has found something far more solid, joy and security in God, regardless of external conditions. How often do we base our joy and trust on things that can fail? A job, a relationship, health, or even our own abilities? Habakkuk shows us that true peace and joy come from placing our trust in God, who never fails. The chapter ends with a powerful vision of a prophet who has chosen faith over fear, trust over doubt, and praise over complaint. Habakkuk rises above his circumstances as he himself describes, "The Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights." This prayer leaves us with an eternal lesson. Even when everything seems lost, we can find strength and joy in the Lord. He is our rock, our refuge, and our sustainer. Habakkuk chose to trust, and that choice made all the difference. Habakkuk ended his journey as a transformed man, but his story doesn't end with him. The lessons he learned and recorded are as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. His experience wasn't just about understanding God amidst chaos, but about living by faith in any circumstance. These lessons continue to resonate in our lives. One of the greatest truths from Habakkuk's story is that faith is not a tool to avoid suffering, but an anchor to face it. Like Habakkuk, we often encounter situations that seem unjust or meaningless. Unexpected losses, financial crises, illnesses, or the suffering of innocent people. It's easy to ask why God or how long. But Habakkuk teaches us that we can bring these questions directly to God, trusting that He not only tolerates our doubts, but welcomes them. Another important lesson is that God's silence does not mean inactivity. Just as Habakkuk learned that God was working in unseen ways to correct and redeem, we also need to remember that God operates on His timeline, not ours. Often we want immediate answers and quick solutions, but Habakkuk's vision reminds us that God has a greater plan, one we may not always be able to see. Habakkuk also shows us the importance of trusting God, even when circumstances seem bleak. He declared, "Though the fig tree does not bud, yet I will rejoice in the Lord." This statement carries immense power. It challenges us to find our joy not in circumstances, but in God. This doesn't mean ignoring the pain or pretending everything is fine. It means recognizing that, even in the midst of the storm, God is our strength and hope. In today's world, where we are constantly bombarded with news of tragedies, injustices, and global crises, Habakkuk's message is a vital reminder. No matter how chaotic the world seems, God remains in control. His justice will come, even if it's not on our timeline. His goodness endures, even when we can't immediately see it. Habakkuk challenges us to live by faith. Living by faith is more than believing in God. It's trusting Him in every decision, every challenge, every moment of doubt. It's an active faith that chooses to look to God rather than focus on circumstances. For us, this might mean persisting in prayer when it feels like God isn't answering. It might mean trusting that He has a plan, even when we lose something important. It might mean praising God, even when things don't go as we hoped. Habakkuk ended his journey by saying, "The Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights." This declaration didn't come from favorable circumstances, but from an unshakable trust in God. And this is the final lesson. When we trust Him, we find the strength to face anything and the ability to walk above life's difficulties. like a traveler navigating steep terrain with steady feet. Today, the question for all of us is, are you willing to live by faith, to trust in God, even without fully understanding His plans? Like Habakkuk, we can choose to trust, to praise, and to live in faith. This choice isn't easy, but it is transformative. And it's this faith that sustains us, even in the darkest times. Now it's your turn to share. What did you learn from Habakkuk's story? Have you ever faced moments when God seemed silent? How do you deal with doubt and waiting? Write your experience or the part of this message that impacted you most in the comments. We want to know how this story spoke to your heart. And remember, your reflection can inspire and encourage others who are going through similar challenges. Let's build a space of faith and hope together. May God bless your life abundantly. I'll see you in the next video.